and this is the Reclaiming the Garden podcast.
So we are super excited for today's interview guest. We will be talking to our good friend, Amy Kósa, who comes all the way from Hungary. And today's episode will be diving into Amy's journey in terms of faith and deconstruction, as well as the differences in the church between Hungary and the United States, and everything in between that. April and I were fortunate enough to meet Amy at the Q Christian Fellowship Conference in 2021, and we really bonded over the fact that we were all deconstructing, we were in different parts of our journey, and that we were evangelicals, and we were able to have some amazing conversations in regards to that. So we're excited to bring the conversation here today.
Amy Kósa is a Hungarian advocate, researcher, artist, human, etc. Although she might have always been a progressive Christian at heart, she grew up in conservative evangelical contexts. She began adopting a more open worldview in her teenage years thanks to a youth group, and she eventually started researching progressive theology after close friends coming out. Since then, she has been a member of various international religious communities, and she is currently pursuing a PhD, focusing on the dynamics of evangelical and progressive Christianity in the United States. Welcome, Amy.
Hello, everyone. I'm so honored to be your very first guest in your podcast, and it is truly amazing to be here. And thank you so much for this lovely introduction.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you, because we've had so many interesting conversations before. And so we figured we'd just start out by asking, tell us about your religious background.
Oh my goodness, there is a lot to that. So first of
We have
all,
time.
Yeah, I absolutely do. So this is a pretty heavy start, but I grew up as a preacher's kid. I am originally Reformed, and I am still Reformed, but I am going to maybe talk about Hungary's denominations briefly because they might be different from the United States denominations. So our largest denomination is the Catholic religion, and after that there are some Reformed people, and I think that is most popular at or best known at around Michigan. It's close to Presbyterian in the United States for those of the listeners who don't exactly know what Reformed is.
Got it.
And there are some Lutherans in the country as well, but I think that takes up about 2% of the population, so there are not too many of them, and there are some Baptists, Pentecostals, and smaller denominations as well, and some Orthodox people, but that's, I think, is really just at around, or those are, I think, are just really at around 10,000 members maybe, or 10,000 of members. So I grew up in a Reformed church in rural Hungary, and I was a preacher's kid, and I adopted a pretty conservative worldview in connection with God and in connection with the church and life in general. And this was shaped by various impacts from my home life as well, which was never quite separate from my church life, and also from kindergarten and elementary school, high school, various places of education, church camps, and as a result, I have adapted some kind of an evangelical worldview, and this started to change, or this started to be challenged when I started attending a youth group in the town where I lived at the time, and in the town where I went to school when I was at around 14 years old, and we had a very, very lovely progressive preacher, and my perfectionism in connection with faith and my fundamentalism was quite challenged in that context. So after starting to attend this youth group, my view on religion has slowly started shifting from a set of rules and a set of commands to actually loving other people, and this was really important to me because I can remember that we have talked about deconstruction, and when we started deconstructing, and when we became progressive Christians in our group, and to that I have said that I I might have always been a progressive Christian at heart because I have always wanted the best for people. I never really wanted to hurt anyone, but well, with fundamentalism, that was borderline impossible. So, so, so I was really happy for this shift because I could have a more authentic relationship with God, and I could be a better human being as well. And I really discovered progressive Christianity when this youth pastor of mine came out as gay when I was 19 years old.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, we had known each other for like 5 years at that point, and we weren't like BFFs at that point or something like that, but you know, like we had been up to date with each other's life and stuff like that, and I was obviously worried about him, especially
Yeah.
that Hungary is a much more conservative country, and our religions or our religious views are much more conservative as well,
I see.
and I really wanted to make sure that he's safe, and I wanted to identify with his situation, which is something that I couldn't naturally do because I have never been attracted to the same sex, and at that point he was like, well, if you want to read up on it, I have a book which is about gay Christian's life, and then he handed me Justin Lee's Torn, and
Yes.
from then on, I can hear from your voices that you like that book too.
Definitely familiar with it. That's
Yeah.
awesome that like you were able to have that connection in the church group that you were in. Was the denomination that this youth pastor that they were a part of, was it considered an affirming denomination as a whole, or was it just an affirming progressive youth group, I guess?
I think it was an affirming youth group and
Okay.
and an affirming church. So the situation in Hungary in connection with gay and other kinds of queer people serving in the church is that the official policy of the Reformed Church in Hungary says that if you are a queer person or if you are an ally to queer people and you are open about it, then you cannot serve in the church in any form whatsoever. So this friend of mine eventually had to leave his job, but everybody in the church was extremely understanding and extremely accepting of him. So I think it was a progressive church.
That's good to know. That's like actually kind of refreshing to hear, because I think a lot of times you hear like, oh, this person in the church was fired for being queer, and at least what I've seen, a lot of times churches try to brush that under the rug, but that's pretty cool that they were
Yep.
accepting of that, and that they were in a way almost disappointed that he had to leave his job.
Yeah, we were actually very disappointed. So I was definitely thankful for the church at the time.
That's awesome. And that's awesome that you were able to have that that affirmation that like being a progressive Christian and being able to connect with other queer Christians was a
I think so too.
good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and basically this was the point when I started researching, because first of all I was interested in the topic and I found it to be really interesting, and second of all, as I have mentioned before, I had known this friend of mine for approximately 5 years, and I was really upset that he was leaving, and I might have used researching and activism as a coping method at the time. And I think that from this point of view, it's really telling that I am about to write a dissertation on evangelicalism.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I definitely want to hear like all about that. That's such a cool part of what you're doing, you know, based off of like your experiences. Now you have this like work that you're doing in your life that's informing that. So yeah, tell us about that research.
Yeah, so basically the way I started researching this topic in school was that after my friends coming out, I really have read an enormous amount of LGBT Christian literature. And I have also become involved, or I also became involved at that point with queer Christian activism, and I studied English at the time. I think I was in my first year, yes, the second semester of my first year of my BA when this happened, and the year after that, I had to decide on my thesis topic. And I remember that at a point when I always, I always went back to my dorm with a gay book that I borrowed from my friend. My roommate remarked that I'm reading so much on this topic that I was reading so much on this topic that I could write a thesis on that. And at that time, I wasn't really sure about it because I went to a Christian university and I lived in a Christian dorm, so I thought that there would be something at stake if I did that. But I thought that this was not a stupid idea. Quite the opposite of that, actually. And a year later, when I needed to hand in my thesis topics, so I studied English. I cannot recall whether I have mentioned that before, but basically studying English in Hungary is not English literature like in the United States, but it's the language itself and linguistics and literature and history and all of that. So I could eventually link these books to modern U.S. history because well, most of the authors were from the United States, and I ended up comparing the U.S. situation to Hungary's situation in my thesis eventually. And that's when I started researching progressive Christianity, and eventually I shifted from queer Christianity to progressive Christianity because I have realized at some point that I have never been attracted to the same sex, and I have never had the experience of being trans, and there are not too many queer scholars in Hungary, but I noticed that I might not be the best spokesperson for this. I did not know at the time that I was demisexual, but I figured that later. But I would still prefer a gay person to talk about gay Christianity or a trans person to talk about trans Christianity. But I realized that I do have an experience of being a Christian ex-evangelical, and that I could definitely talk about that. And eventually the way this came about is that I ended up writing my master's thesis on Rachel Held Evans's literature. And
do you have a favorite? I know it might be hard to choose, but do you have a favorite book that she's written? Which I realize is a very tough question, even as I'm asking it.
Yeah, that is a tough question.
Sorry.
I would probably say so Searching for Sunday was the most touching one for me, and I think that, or I would just rather say that if somebody were to ask for a book that introduced them to Rachel Held Evans's work, then I would probably recommend A Year of Biblical Womanhood, because that's
absolutely
the one that I have found to be the most entertaining one. But I love all of the books for very different reasons. So for example, Faith Unraveled could give you a background on what exactly Rachel Held Evans's worldview is and why, and Inspired is also something absolutely fascinating for everybody more interested in the theological background and the everyday applications of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right now, I'm reading A Year of Biblical Womanhood, and it's lovely. And I also, just kind of for fun, I guess, I've been also reading her blog post that she was posting during her Year of Biblical Womanhood, which is really interesting. Yeah, FYI to everyone listening, Rachel Held Evans' blog, like it still has all of her posts on it. You can still look through and like see the whole journey that she took, and she was just such an incredible person.
Exactly.
going to say, Year of Biblical Womanhood is just also such a great starting point. Like, I definitely agree with you on that, Amy, because that was the first one that I had read after it being recommended quite a bit. And then that was, I think, honestly, that book kind of sent me down the deconstruction and, like, progressive Christian rabbit hole. Like, that was the book. Because I was like, oh, wow. And I was like, because I'll be honest, like, I saw that book in a library, and it's unfortunate that when you think Year of Biblical Womanhood, it's like, oh, great, this is going to be about, like, being a submissive wife and how to do all, like, how to be a Proverbs 31 woman. Exactly, and I was like, oh, no, I don't want to read that. That's awful. And then, like, as I started hearing her name in more progressive circles, I was like, okay, I think I might have judged a book by its cover with this one. Let me actually go and read it. And I'm like, and then from there, I got more into her other books and everyone else in her circle of awesome progressive Christian humans.
Yeah, and I think that actually this titling is clever because I don't know whether that was her intention, but maybe some conservative Christians who would like to know how to be a submissive wife would pick this book up.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I just wanted to say, or I just wanted to add previously that Rachel Hyde Evans also posted a lot on Facebook and Twitter, and those are still available as well.
So I'm really curious about, like, in your thesis on her all of her literature, like, what was some of the things that you learned or some interesting conclusions that you made, you know, and I'm really curious about that.
I pretty much try to introduce her literature, and I try to take a look at how this goes against mainstream evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that I have made any particularly interesting discoveries, but I am reserving those to my PhD because I have noticed, like, a couple of pages into writing, that there is much more material into that than what I could take a look at, and that's why I would like to start a PhD because in my master's thesis I said I would like to start a PhD, but I have actually started my PhD, so I don't even know what I'm talking about here. This is my first
It's all blending
year,
together.
So maybe it doesn't feel like I have started it because of like long distance education, but I have started it.
Yeah.
Believe me, I'm not an imposter.
No, not at all.
So in my master's thesis, there was pretty much only space for introducing these 4 books and examining the views that she has in connection with theology and the way that she interprets theology. And what I am planning to do for my PhD, this is a 4-year program, and I'm in my first year, so a lot of things need to be clarified yet, but I have also added Nadia Bolz-Weber's books to this thesis, and I would actually like to examine them from a literary aspect as well. I would try to introduce them to Hungarian readers potentially because they are not very well known here, and I would like to do surveys and stuff like that in connection with the everyday experiences of US evangelicals, and maybe I could also ask evangelicals to listen to the views of the other side, and I would just like to examine how this manifests in practice and what makes like progressive Christianity more attractive than evangelicalism. So I pretty much have these goals so far, and I also have this hypothesis which might file under the category of interesting discoveries, that I think that Rachel Hyde Evans's work is significant because she was a lay person. So I think that or at least as I have noticed, that certain theologians, or especially certain conservative theologians, believe that you do not have a right to be dissatisfied with religion unless you have a degree in theology, and unless you can support those those views in an argument. And if you are a layperson, your argument cannot be sound and it cannot be impartial, and you are not even worth to be listened to. And I think that Rachel Held Evans refutes all of these accusations in a very, very phenomenal way. And I think that her writings give many other lay people the power to be dissatisfied with evangelicalism.
I think that Rachel Held Evans really transformed like what it is to be a public theologian, and just also, yeah, just like a progressive Christian in the world. Like, she really has left this amazing legacy of other folks that have been inspired by her. It's really incredible.
Absolutely.
And one thing that I really enjoy too is her writings are for everyone. I think a lot of times I've definitely tried to go and read papers and books by certain theologians, and I don't have a seminary background. Like, I'm just someone who's very fascinated by my own faith. And I very much enjoy that Rachel Held Evans makes it easy for anyone to learn more about progressive theology and more feminist theology. I just think that's very admirable. And it also just drives me a little bit nuts when it's like, oh, if you're not a theology student or an MDiv student, like, you have no right to speak on the Bible. It's like, you can though. Like, I think there's just hypocrisy there, which just makes me really sad. Like, I don't think it's right at all, but I love that there's so many progressive theologians now who are so well researched and well read and know exactly what they're talking about, that are coming out with books and podcasts where it's like, yeah, I have this theology that a lot of conservatives don't agree with, but you can't say I'm not well researched.
The Bible and theology belong to all of us, you know? That's part of what we're doing here at Reclaiming the Garden, or reclaiming these parts of the faith that are ours.
Exactly. And I am really happy that you brought this up, because this problem that academic books and sources are basically inaccessible to people who are not experts is a huge problem, but it's pretty much everywhere. As I have mentioned before, I studied English, and it has been a problem before that basically all of my group mates have mentioned. One of them phrased it this way, that does anybody understand what this text is actually about? Because I can understand the words individually, but I cannot make sense of them. Yeah, there are a lot of academics who are trying to demonstrate their knowledge by using language that basically cannot be understood, not even by native speakers. I am saying this because I'm a non-native, but native speakers also have problems with that. I have sent it to a bunch of native speaker friends, or like texts like that. So I always really appreciate when people try to not sound that pretentious, and when they are actually trying to educate us, because you know, whenever I see a paper like that, I think that, or I can't help but think that this is more about polishing the author's ego, because you know, if you make your literature inaccessible, then nobody is going to read it. And there are not too many people in their specific fields already, so this might be a hot take, but
It's a good take.
I'm actually not so sorry for that.
I think Christianity is it's truly meant for everyone, and it's unfortunate that there's so many pastors and theologians that are like, no, this is exactly what the Bible means, and if you look into it any further from any other perspective, it's a lack of faith, or you don't believe hard enough. And from what I've noticed, the people that believe in it the most are the people that were very far into evangelicalism are the ones that do this deconstruction work, because they do truly want to know all sides of that story and see how it can truly be applicable to their own lives. Because I think a lot of times in conservatism, at least especially in the US, it's very much a thing of like, you're part of the world, but you're not of the world. So like, don't participate in politics, don't participate in culture, don't participate in any of these things.
But of course, evangelicals participate in politics all the... Yeah, they participate in politics.
I know, they're a major voting bloc.
Yeah, just what I was going to say. What do evangelicals do then? 81% of them voted for Trump in 2016. do not participate
Such a
in politics.
disappointing statistic. It's so disappointing.
I know.
Sometimes to your point about like the people who are most like deeply in the evangelical church, actually I end up reconstructing, like sometimes I'm like, evangelicals deserve honorary theology degrees because of how much we have read the Bible,
Yes,
how much we have read like literature, like we have to dig ourselves out like bit by bit, and like it takes work. I mean, I did it while I was in college, and I'm like, it takes a lot of work. Emotionally and intellectually.
Exactly. I can speak of my personal experience, but I have been much more theologically well versed since I have become a progressive Christian, because back when I was a fundamentalist and back when I was evangelical, my strongest argument was, but it's in the Bible and it's written there, and it's like that literally, no questions.
The Bible is clear. The Bible plainly says.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It might say something clearly, but it meant something else in the original language or in the original context.
Absolutely. And people seem to forget, like when they say that the Bible is so clear, they forget that Jesus spoke in parables to teach major lessons.
Yes.
Like
And
they just
some of them,
forget that.
honestly,
and the reason we
like-
understand them is because we have 2,000 years of hindsight. That's the only reason why we understand what they mean now.
Honestly, sometimes I don't understand what they mean. Honestly, in reading through the Gospels, I'm like, sometimes like, Jesus, what do you mean? Like,
Yeah.
like,
Like
Yeah,
I was even
and-
reading a
and
passage
I
in
can-
Proverbs, and like one verse said, like, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was one verse that said, do this thing, and the very next verse said not to do that thing. It's like, no,
Yeah, exactly.
the Bible is not clear on any of these things.
Yeah, and I am actually fascinated by the language aspect of it, because I am a language teacher and I have done some translation work in the past, and I basically exist in two languages in my everydays. So I can weigh in on that, and basically translation can distort a lot of things, and translation can significantly alter meanings, or it can leave out meanings that were originally there. So I think that just the sole fact that the Bible was written in different languages, which are not related to English in a very close way, that in itself should be something for consideration.
yeah, I'm really curious. There are a lot of, in English, there are like a lot of Bible translations. How many are there in Hungarian?
I am pretty sure that there aren't as many Bible translations as in English. I don't know the exact number, but I think that the most translations were written during medieval periods, or as far as I remember, and they also vary by denomination. So, for example, Catholics use a different translation than Protestants do, and I use I think the second newest translation of the Protestant Bible.
It's like, I didn't even think to ask about like, translations in Hungarian versus translations in English. Because I don't know, I guess in my brain I was like, yeah, like all the English translations are probably also all available in Hungarian. Like I never would have thought, would have thought about that.
So yeah, in French. For those listening, I also studied French in college. And when I attended in Paris, I think the church I attended, which actually was evangelical, funny story, but we'll get into that later. In a later episode. We used the Bible Second 21, which does not have any like American equivalent. I mean, I think or English equivalent, and I think it was similar to the NIV when I was doing some comparisons, but not entirely.
Yes, I think that this is because people in Europe and especially reformers believed that the translation needs to be translated from the original. So this is why we don't have equivalents to the English versions, because if you translate things multiple times, then it's
Telephone.
Yeah, I was about to say.
You can take a look at Translator Fails on YouTube. Do you know that channel?
No.
No, I've never heard it.
Actually, it's not biblical, but it's songs put through multiple layers of Google Translate. Yeah, the results are always extremely funny. So, what I wanted to say by this is that if there is, say, the original language, and that is translated to English, and then the English version is translated to Hungarian, then that would be significantly more distorted and artificial than just translating from the originals to Hungarian.
I do have a question. So I know that you were saying Hungary is a little bit more, it's more of a conservative country.
Yeah.
And the churches are also a little bit more conservative. Is there like a heavy church influence in the government, or is it just...
Oh my God, yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. So basically the way you have to imagine Hungary is that we are about 20 years behind you, or 30.
Okay.
The more you move to the east in Europe, the more conservative a country gets.
I see.
We are in Central Europe, so we are not the worst off, but we are pretty conservative, or the country is overall pretty conservative, and the government is pretty big on this traditional Christian family life, one man, one woman, no gay people, and so on rhetoric. And actually, I am sad to say this, but the prime minister is also reformed, so he supports like conservative mainline Protestant churches, and also just conservative religion in general. So.
Oy, oy, oy. I see. Okay. Would you say like the queer community in Hungary as well? Like, would you say that it has to kind of remain, for lack of a better word, closeted in a sense, or is there a pretty prevalent queer community as best as there can be, I guess?
Well, I can talk about queer Christians because I have more experience with that one. There are LGBT people who are able to live out and proud. So we do have a lot of out queer people.
Okay.
But I think that in churches it is not too common, because churches are still pretty conservative, and I think that that for most queer adults the factor that's coming out depends on is the acceptance level at your workplace. So for example, I know a bunch of queer people, or I know some queer people in the Hungarian queer Christian group who cannot come out because their workplaces would not be affirming, and some of them have some kind of a church related work as well. And that way they obviously cannot be outed. But there are also a lot of LGBT people in the country who are able to be authentically themselves. Although it is kind of difficult in the country because same-sex adoption has just been pretty much banned.
Oh my God.
So, and name changes for trans people has also been banned pretty recently.
Oh, geez.
Gosh.
So it's kind of difficult.
So, given that the country is on the more conservative side, you know, when talking about American evangelicalism, we also talk about like the white nationalism that is present and white supremacy. So I'm curious about whether there's a sort of like Hungarian nationalism and white supremacy that shows up in the Reformed Church in Hungary.
I think that white supremacy might not be as strong or as talked about as it is in the United States, but I overall think that churches tend to avoid this subject, so it is not really talked about in a church context. This is just my input, by the way. Somebody from a different church or somebody with a different experience from the same country might believe it otherwise.
Absolutely.
We have racial and ethnic minorities in Hungary, and as far as I have perceived, there are some churches that just like to sweep the whole issue under the rug, and there are some churches who strive to be really inclusive with our minorities. So some of them try to provide them with schooling alternatives and opportunities for hanging out and missions and stuff like that, and they try to actively include them in church. So I think that the views on this differ greatly. I think it also depends on where you are at geographically, because bigger cities tend to be more affirming, for example, of queer people. So I live in the capital of Hungary now, which is Budapest, and queer people are usually safer here than in the countryside. I originally come from a small village, and I never met an openly queer person there because
Wow.
there aren't really opportunities to come out in a village that has about 2,000 inhabitants, and usually usually religious leaders tend to be less affirming there. And I think that in areas where certain minorities are more common, for example racial minorities, they have to deal with the issues regarding that, and they
Right.
have to deal with inclusion in some way. But there are some people who can afford, so to say, to sweep it under the rug, and they live with this opportunity.
I did have another question too, because, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, you studied abroad in the US at one point, correct?
Yes.
What were the differences you noticed between like the church in Hungary versus if you were active at all in a church community in the United States? Like, were there any like differences where you were like, oh wow, this is completely different, or was it pretty similar?
So I am going to say that, or I am going to make a disclaimer that I only studied in the United States for about a month.
Okay.
So I am not as well familiar with United States customs as somebody who lived there for multiple years. But I did go to church during that time, and I have been to the U.S. multiple times apart from that. So I might have some experience. I would say that the first one is I went to a university in Michigan, Calvin University, which was a church university, and
Got it.
there has recently been a scandal that somebody put up a sign saying that LGBTQ is a sin, change my mind, and stuff like that, and but that was countered by a lot of affirming reactions. I went to that university in 2018, in early 2018, and one of the major differences that I encountered was that I attended a course in connection with LGBT Christianity, and
Okay.
I felt very welcome in connection with that. So the fact that a Christian university can host such a course without getting in trouble is definitely a difference. And it was also definitely a difference that whenever I was asked about my course by the people I lived in the same dorm with, or people I just, randomly bumped into in the lunch hall or something like that, I don't know what they actually thought about it, but whenever I told my major, they just responded that it was cool, and nobody told me that I was going to hell, and nobody asked any inquisitive questions about that. And I think that a general difference is that Americans are much more outgoing people than Hungarians are. So So that for sure is a difference in lifestyle and worship style and preaching style and everything, because
Got it.
because the preaching was pretty down to earth,
Okay.
and everybody was a little bit, I don't want to say more welcoming at church, but they were more likely to just strike up a conversation and
Yes.
stuff like that. We are not assholes, but we tend to be more reserved, and we let people in much more slowly.
Got it.
So I'm not sure whether I would try to strike up a conversation with a newcomer, especially because I wouldn't want them to feel pressured. And I think that the most noticeable difference is that the United States tends to be, or United States Christianity tends to be more towards the edges of the acceptance spectrum. So, for example, in the United States, you have very, very extremely unaccepting Christians
Yeah.
or extremely accepting Christians. And in Hungary, that's somewhere towards the middle, as I would say, or at least we are upfront about it. So what I have noticed in the United States is that there is an extreme amount of Christian parents who would disown their LGBT kids without a problem.
Yeah.
And I think that in a similar situation in Hungary, an LGBT kid would not be disowned and would not have to live on the streets. They would probably be mentally abused, but that is still a less extreme reaction. It sucks, but it is still a less extreme reaction.
Yeah.
And also in the United States, there is, on the other of the spectrum, there is an extreme amount of affirming churches and openly affirming churches who put rainbow flags on their church and who express that they are inclusive. This wouldn't happen in Hungary because they would risk their jobs. I know some preachers who are affirming, and I know some religious teachers who are affirming and who think that being LGBT is not a sin, but this only turns out once you talk to them about it, because they either do not have an opportunity to be open, or they believe that to be a private thing.
Yeah, of course. It's not information that's like readily volunteered.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think that Lutherans are the most progressive in connection with this topic in Hungary, because well, we know that the Catholic Church in general does not really involve LGBT people, so to say, or that it thinks that being LGBT is a sin. And I have also talked about the stance of the Reformed Church in Hungary, and the smaller denominations have a very significant overlap with fundamental evangelicalism most of the time.
I see. Yeah, that's so interesting too, because like that's cool that like Lutherans are more considered open in Hungary, whereas here I think it's a pretty mixed bag, I'd say. Like you have some Lutheran churches that are very accepting and very open, and then you have, just like you were saying, there's like the two extremes of some are super accepting and some aren't.
The big difference in the United States with the Lutherans is whether they're ELCA, which is Nadia Bolz-Weber's denomination,
Right. Okay.
and then the Missouri Synod. I might not be saying that quite correctly. There's something like LCMS. Again, I might not, probably in the show notes I'll put what it actually is. That's the one that's known for like being more conservative. Actually, I had a friend who grew up in the conservative Lutheran church in America, and she talked about how they did snake handling. Like actually handling snakes.
I've heard of churches
Oh
doing
my
that.
God.
It's so bizarre.
It's like a test of faith thing, It's like, how brave are you? Which kind of reminds me of how Christians right now are putting themselves in danger sometimes by like not wearing a mask, because they're brave. Like,
Oh my God, no. And I mean, how is not wearing a mask supposed to serve other people? Like the Bible says, love thy neighbor, and I think that this requires no explanation. How do you love your neighbor if you could, potentially contract a deadly disease, or make them contract a deadly disease because you might be a contact person?
Exactly. It's so bizarre to me that people say like, oh, the United States is a Christian nation, when one of the main tenets of Christianity is being able to serve your neighbor and protect those around you and clothe the poor and feed the hungry. But the United States is a country that is so individualistic, where it's like, like
Yeah.
my rights, which again is very depending on who you ask what rights those are, they will give you very different answers. But it's very much like, oh, it's my right to do what I want, and if you don't like it, you can leave, and all these things. And it's like, but I thought we're a Christian nation where we serve and help each other. It's such a weird. There's just a lot of cognitive
Yeah.
dissonance with all of it, to be honest.
And that individualism affects the entirety of evangelical theology.
Oh my
You know,
gosh,
especially
yeah.
particularly the way
Exactly.
that the gospel is taught is like you just pray this prayer and you've got your ticket to heaven, you know?
Yeah.
Like that's all it is. Even and that's like, oh my gosh, like it's so much bigger than that, than just like this one thing and you don't have to I don't know. Um
Yeah, Hungary tends to be a much more submissive nation, and we are much more focused on everybody else's expectations. I think that this stems from our history because we have been ruled by a variety of different nations and empires who did not want us well. And I think that Hungarians sort of have this mentality that no matter what kind of rights you get used to, they can be stripped away from you tomorrow.
Wow.
And I think that because of this, we tend to be a bit more pessimistic, and we tend to be a little bit more paranoid. And I think that an individualistic worldview can sound promising to us. So that is why
I see.
there are very many young people who find evangelicalism appealing, because that way they can focus on themselves, and they can strengthen their own personality and their own beliefs, and because it is basically up to date.
That is so, yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. That's so interesting. I also think it is an active choice to be a Christian who serves others. I think it's an active choice that you have to make every day.
Yes.
Like, it's not just something where, like, oh, again, like saying, like, the sinner's prayer and being like, great, now I'm a Christian, ta-da! Like, no, like, it's an active choice to be like, I'm Christian, but because of that, I need to live a Christ-like life, and taking those active steps to do so.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, or that's one of the reasons why I am so mad at evangelicals and certain Christians for pushing young people to be born again. Like, you can push
Yeah.
that sort of experience, and then
Well,
threaten
it's all
eternal
about
damnation if that doesn't happen.
It's all about the
Yeah.
numbers. It's all about putting seats in pews. It's all about how many people go up to an altar call. You know, it's about how many people get saved at the summer camp. Like, it's just all about numbers because all they seem to care about. I mean, it is this, I mean, it's motivated by a fear of hell. Because I mean, you know, if you really honest to God believe that that place exists, like, yes, I would be screaming in the streets. I would be
Yeah.
like with a fucking bullhorn, like, because
Yeah.
I would want no one to go there. But you know, it sort of ends up being this twisted love because you end up hurting people in the process of doing things
That's
like
what I
that.
did when I was 12, and I'm still sorry about that. I have noticed that evangelicals and conservative Christians in general tend to be very good at loving people with an agenda.
Oh, yeah.
So for example, there is this whole concept. I am pretty sure that you have heard about it. That be friends with that atheist girl in school. Do not become
Heard that
close
all the
friends.
time in youth group.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do not become too close friends, because then they might trick you with all of their questions about I don't know, Noah's Ark and evolution and stuff like that, and you might end up just like them. But you should be friends so that you could call this person to youth group, and then they would eventually convert, or she. I started this example with a girl, but we can use they in general because
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter. But I think that this is extremely harmful, because it never teaches you to love people for who they are, and it also teaches you to always have some kind of an ulterior motive every single
Yeah.
time you love someone, and you know what kind of people love like that? Narcissists.
Yeah.
100%.
I remember always feeling so guilty that I was like, oh, I don't like talk about Jesus enough in school to my classmates. Like I don't witness enough to to people, and it was
Yeah.
because honestly, like I literally like prayed to God. I was like, oh, if I need to like witness to someone, I need to like pound the Holy Spirit on my heart. Just tell me,
Yeah, like speak through me.
give me the window. And like that window never really came. And so
Yeah.
I shame myself about it, even though like actually, I don't think Jesus is ever calling me to do that. And I don't think the Bible tells us that we're supposed to do that. So
Yeah, and one
Yeah.
sentiment I heard in church a few times was, and this isn't even biblically accurate, I don't know why this was preached to me, but it's like when you go to heaven, God will ask you how many people you brought with you,
Oh
which
yeah.
isn't a verse in the Bible. And two, that's just like, that it adds to that guilt of like, how many people will
Exactly.
I bring with me? Like, I need to save and convert as many people as possible. And it's all based on fear. And it's looking at like the fruit that theology bears. And when you say things like, you have to be born again or you'll burn, or God will be disappointed in you if you don't convert, like that's a theology
Oh my
just that
God.
is producing very fearful fruit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this view is like inherently twisted because eventually the conversion of those people does not depend on you but on them. You
Yeah.
can try all that you can, but eventually the decision whether they will convert or not will be made by them. And if they don't want to convert, if they are determined not to convert, then you cannot really change that. And I think that it is also extremely toxic that people are told that God loves them in the same way or in a similar way. And I think that the point when I was able to shift my relationship with God into a more, how to put it, accepting form or a more genuine form was when I was able to shift this love because this divine narcissistic love never really sat well with me. And my exact experience was that so so it happened after the first time I went to the United States. I visited two of my friends there, and for 5 weeks straight, I was exposed to unconditional love, which I could not escape.
Wow.
And and after that, when I went back to Hungary, we read The Shack with my youth group. And for those of the listeners who don't know The Shack, it is a phenomenal book. I can only recommend it. It basically tackles the subject of why do excruciatingly horrible things happen to good people, and where is God in all of this. And the main character has some, well, he has this conservative evangelical view, this typical view on God as a punitive God. And maybe this is not too much of a spoiler, but this will be significantly challenged in the book. And I realized that a couple of chapters into reading that book that maybe God loves me the same way as my friends do.
oh, that's
amazing.
so heartwarming. I love that.
That's amazing that you were able to like experience that love from your friends, because
Yeah.
I think especially in the church, a lot of times, at least a lot of my church friendships for a very long time were pretty conditional.
Yeah.
And one thing that I will hear sometimes from my therapist is like, the way we see ourselves is the way we see God. And I saw myself being like conditionally loved by friends in my life. And that's how I thought God loved me as well, which isn't the case. Even in the Bible, it's not the case. Like, God's love is unconditional. You can't separate yourself from God. But it's hard when like other people in your life treat you a certain way, and those people are considered to be like the quote unquote real Christians. And it's like, oh, they're treating me
Yeah.
with this like really conditional, kind of snarky, holier than thou attitude. Maybe that's how God is as well. Or maybe they know something I don't.
Yeah, I am actually really lucky because all of my youth group friends are absolutely amazing, wonderful human beings, but I do have a significant preacher's kid past.
Yeah.
And yeah, that is pretty characteristic of being held to extremely high standards, especially when it comes to faith, by pretty much everybody, including yours. Okay, so the first university I talked about, where I wrote my 2 theses that I have mentioned, so that one is a Reformed university, and now I attend a Catholic university, and that is because when you want to write a PhD, or at least in Hungary, you do not pick a university, but you pick a topic. So usually the way this is that there is a website in which a bunch of like wider topics are announced next to the name of the instructor or the advisor, and you have to apply for those. So this was available at a Catholic university. So I'm at a Catholic university now, and the university in the US is Reformed as well.
Got it. Okay. With all of the amazing work that you're doing with your PhD and all of the things you've learned, and if you don't have like a clear answer, that's totally fine. Like, what ideally would you want to do with this absolute well of knowledge and information at some point?
Thank you for the compliment, firstly, and I would like to teach at a university. I am really fond of the university where I did my bachelor's and master's, so I am hoping to go back there, and I am a teacher right now. I teach English as a second language, so I will probably do that on the side. And I am also thinking about ways of getting involved with American and Hungarian queer Christian communities or queer communities. I don't know how exactly I could use this study in Hungary. I used to have a bunch of groups that I was involved with here in Hungary, but I am a little bit torn because I used to start out as an activist, and I realized that I'm more of an advocate type of a person. So I like to be on the more peaceful side. So I am trying to somehow figure that out for myself. But I would definitely like to have a way to talk about this.
And you definitely have that passion for teaching as well, because I feel like every time I'm lucky to have that we're lucky to have a conversation with you, I feel like I learned so much. So that definitely comes across.
Yeah, and I'm sure your dissertation will be helpful to a lot of people. It's going to be really good.
Yeah, I really hope so.
What faith communities are you a part of right now? Obviously, I'm not talking about like buildings, especially during these COVID times. Definitely not talking about buildings. What would you consider your faith or spiritual community right now?
So I still visit the same youth group as I used to. Back in my hometown, that is like 2 hours away from me, we meet up occasionally. We usually meet up on Zoom these days. So I visit that community, and I am actually trying to find a community for myself in my city because I still haven't done that, even though I have lived here for 5 years. And I am a little bit at crossroads with that because I think this is partially due to my PK past, when I had to be at church and adhere to all of the customs for basically 17 years. I was 17 years old when I quit my father's church. And since then, I have always known that I have a need to go to a church, and I feel at peace when I'm in a church. But I just physically can't do it sometimes. I don't know if this makes sense.
Oh, 100%.
No. When you experience religious trauma, you experience it in your body. And so, that totally makes sense.
So I'm trying to work that out. I would definitely like to join a church at some point, but it is also a bit overwhelming that there are a lot of options here. So after I quit my father's church, I lived in a small town, and there was one church for every denomination. And now I live in a city that has a population of 2 million people. So there are significantly more options here, and especially when no church advertises themselves as openly affirming, I don't really know what direction to start in, but I will eventually figure this out. I think that there are more American communities that are faith communities that I am a part of right now, that Hungarian faith communities. Because I'm in this Evangelical group, and I'm a part of other QCF groups as well, which is the conference where we met.
Yes.
So I'm just sort of all over the place, and I also attend a European LGBT conference, which is held annually, and it is pretty much like QCF, but more along the mainline Protestant line.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cool things about like Reconstruction is that, you know, you do get to sort of build your faith community from the ground up, and you get to
Yeah.
decide where you feel like you fit best based on your gifts and your newfound theology. And it's a really fun thing, you know, even though it can be a little bit overwhelming, it's also fun.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you get to
and
have
I
chosen
met
family.
so many. Yeah, exactly. And I have met so many amazing people during my deconstruction phase, including you.
Yeah.
It's been awesome to just meet so many people, and I think it's cool too because, like, despite the fact that I live in a pretty liberal area of the country, I don't know a lot of queer Christians, and I don't know a lot of even necessarily affirming Christians, to be quite honest. And it's things like QCF I've been able to broaden my horizons and meet people from so many different walks of life and in so many different stages of their life too. And it's just amazing to learn from so many different people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't exactly know how to describe this, but usually the QCF community and everybody's faith in the QCF community is so alive.
Yeah.
And the faith of queer Christians is just in general so alive. I think that this is because everybody in this community is basically forced to deconstruct and find their own faith, and we don't just tend to believe because somebody told us to do so 20 years ago, but we have actually found our own reasons, and that is really incredible. I remember that the first time when I entered the queer Christian community, that was back in Europe. This was the European community. I have just seen so much love among those people that I just had to think that if only homophobes could see this, they would have a totally different view.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's also that thing too of having to fight for your community as well. Like it's almost like, I feel like a lot of times queer Christians or Christians of any sort of marginalized community, you're having to almost fight for your place in it. So one thing I've always joked is never mess with a queer person that knows their Bible, or like never mess with a queer person that knows their Bible, because they know, like, because you're fighting by doing that research and by finding community and by saying, I belong here and I belong with God just as much as everyone else does.
Yeah, and essentially intersections are always a whole entire subculture. So this is what I argued for in my queer Christian thesis, that even within the queer community, queer Christians are an entire subculture, because they face or well, I can say, so queer Christians are essentially an entire subculture, and intersections are an entire subculture. And this is what I argued for in one of my theses, that even within the queer community, queer Christians face an entirely different set of challenges, or even if there are some similarities, but they do have, or queer Christians, I can maybe say we, because as a demisexual, I'm trying to refer to myself as a queer person.
Yeah.
It's still relatively new.
Yeah, of course.
So there is an entire new set of challenges that's non-religious queer people, or that cishet Christian people don't face.
Absolutely.
Besides Rachel Held Evans' works, I'm curious about, any other sort of resources that you'd like to recommend to our audience related to faith deconstruction or progressive Christianity.
Well, I can also recommend Nadia Bolz-Weber,
Oh,
who
100%.
I am also writing my dissertation on. And I have recently discovered Peter Enns, and I can absolutely recommend him as well. And I have been looking into Rob Bell lately. I can recommend him as well. And I think that I can recommend much more on the gay Christian spectrum, because that's where I started most of my journey. I can definitely recommend the Sheck as well.
Yes.
And also, who else comes to mind? Sarah Bessie.
100%.
I can recommend her.
Sorry, The Shack. Who's the author?
So it's William Paul Young.
Also, I love that all the people you've mentioned, they all also have amazing podcasts, which is, they have amazing books and amazing podcasts. I love it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that in general, I would just like to recommend everybody who is interested in deconstruction to ask book recommendations from their friends and to look up books on their own as well, because you have plenty of opportunities to find the books that fit you and your topics of interest the most. And I am also planning to order a huge amount of deconstruction and minorities other than queer types of books as well. So I am still in the process of finding ways to research.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Is there any way that our audience can support you, Amy, in any of your endeavors, any social media, or just any way that we can support you?
So I do not have any official pages,
Okay.
but I might try to do one. I have actually been thinking about making a page for my art, because I do photography. You can get in touch with me on Facebook. I am pretty much the only person who has this name, so
Got
I
it.
can be easily found. Make sure to write me a message, because if you try to add me as a friend and I do not know you, then I will not automatically add you as a friend. So I would say Facebook messaging so far. But
sure.
maybe I will be available on other platforms.
Thank you so much for chatting with us today and sharing some of your story. It's really interesting to see just the differences between, America versus Hungary and the research that you're doing. I can't wait to keep hearing more about it.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It has been great.
All right, thank you so much for listening to this episode and with our interview with Amy. If you like what you hear, be sure to follow us wherever podcasts can be listened to. Also follow us on Instagram at Reclaiming the Garden, or on Twitter at RT Garden Podcast, because Twitter doesn't allow usernames to be over 15 characters. And of course, if you have anything that you particularly want us to talk about, anyone that you would like to see or hear, please feel free to send us a DM, because we would love to get your feedback on that.
And in the show notes, you will find, the various things that we've made references to over the episode, and all of our social media written out. We'll see you next time, where we will be having our very first Bible Dyke deep dive.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone.